In the quiet hours when the world seems to drift between waking and sleep, an old puzzle rises from the northern fog. It begins with the roofs of the Vikings, those weather-beaten structures that stood for generations beneath skies that showed no mercy. Snow piled upon them like slow-moving mountains. Salt winds gnawed at their edges. Rain swept across them year after year. Yet the wood beneath remained whole, almost indifferent to the violence above. There is a calm strangeness in that image, a sense that something in that distant past understood the language of the elements in a way we no longer do. Because today, in an age of machines, measurements, and materials tested in laboratories, our own roofs often surrender after a single harsh season. Shingles curl like abandoned petals. Ceilings stain with slow, seeping shadows. Timber swells, cracks, and loses its strength long before its time. It is as if the past built with patience, while the present builds with haste. And the results echo that difference more loudly than we like to admit. When you picture those ancient homes, lined with soot, warmed by slow-burning fires, surrounded by a world of ice and storm, you may expect them to feel fragile. Yet the opposite is true. The more closely we look, the more the mystery deepens. How did people with little iron, no written plans and tools far simpler than ours create roofs that survived centuries? How did structures assembled in the wilderness stand longer than the ones we raise with trucks, power tools, and perfectly cut lumber? There is a quiet temptation to say it was luck or coincidence. But the deeper you lean into the mystery, the more intentional it appears. Something guided their hands, knowledge shaped not in books, but in winters. They carved, fitted and layered each part with a purpose we have forgotten how to see. Something old, perhaps older than their own stories, pressed itself into the grain of every beam. Imagine walking through one of their villages at dawn. Smoke drifting from longhouse vents, frost clinging to the rough walls, the rooflines dark against the pale sky. Nothing about them shouts for attention, yet they hold a subtle confidence, the way a weathered stone does. They seem to whisper that endurance is not born from strength alone, but from understanding. And that is where the paradox begins. The more we try to explain it through modern logic, the less sense it makes. Why should structures built in a world we call primitive outlast the ones built in a world that claims mastery over nature? What did they know that we quietly lost? These questions linger like cold breath in the air, drawing us deeper into the story. To uncover the truth, we must go back to the world that shaped the Vikings, a land where every storm was a teacher, and every winter carried a lesson in survival. In that frozen silence, their choices became lessons etched into wood, awaiting our rediscovery in the present day. In the far north, where daylight thins and winter lingers like a long-held breath, the land itself becomes part of the story. It is a realm shaped by cold seas and restless skies, a place where storms gather without warning and sweep across the earth with a force that makes even mountain tremble. To understand the mystery of the Viking roof, you must first step into this world, a world that was never gentle, never patient, and never willing to forgive the unprepared. The Vikings lived beneath a sky that tested every structure built beneath it, and yet their homes endured. Across the fjords, winds traveled like living creatures, slipping through narrow stone corridors and emerging with violent strength. These winds tore at anything weak, peeling apart roofs that were not made with that. Freezing rains struck in slanted sheets, turning every exposed surface slick and dangerous. Snow fell not as powder, but as weight, heavy, wet, and unrelenting, layering itself upon rooftops until the beams groaned under the burden. Modern roofs in such conditions often surrender quickly, their materials warped by the cycle of freezing and thawing. But the Viking roofs, curiously, did not. Imagine standing at the edge of a coastal village, watching waves slam against the rocks with thunderous rhythm. The air tastes of salt and cold iron. Homes sit low to the ground, their silhouettes softened by turf and frost. Yet they appear steady, even comfortable beneath the winter sky. These structures existed in harmony with the climate that threatened them, shaped not to resist nature outright, but to move with it. The people who built them understood that a roof in this land had to be more than shelter. It had to be a shield against a world that could swallow the careless. In mountain valleys, the snow piled so deeply that entire settlements vanished beneath drifts. Only the smoke rising from longhouse vents marked where life continued below. The roofs held fast, pressing downward into the earth like sleeping beasts, bearing the immense weight without buckling. In the dark months, when the sun barely rose and silence settled across the frozen fields, these roofs did their quiet work. They did not crack. They did not leak. They endured because they were born from the same landscape that sought to destroy them. It is easy to assume that modern materials, synthetic barriers, engineered planks, precision-fastened shingles, should outperform anything crafted centuries ago. But in environments this unforgiving, many modern roofs fail surprisingly quickly. They were designed for convenience, not survival. And so the question begins to grow. Did the Vikings unlock something about nature that we have overlooked in our pursuit of efficiency? Their world was harsh, but it taught them truths we rarely consider today. To understand what they knew, we must look deeper into the people who shaped these homes and the minds that guided their hands. And as the landscape hardens around them, the story turns toward the builders themselves, whose quiet skill reveals everything about them. Long before the age of measurements and manuals, the Vikings shaped their homes with a kind of instinct that feels almost impossible to imagine today. They lived in a world without written plans, without standardized parts, without charts explaining angles or loads. Yet, when their homes rose from the frozen ground, they carried a confidence that came from something deeper than calculation. Their builders learned not from books, but from winters survived and winters remembered. Knowledge passed from elder to apprentice like a whispered lineage, each generation adding its own quiet lessons to the craft. Picture a group of villagers gathered around the skeleton of a new longhouse. There is no overseer shouting orders, no pile of printed plans rustling in the wind. Instead, there is rhythm, a slow, steady harmony between hands, tools and timber. A shipbuilder studies a beam the same way he would study the ribs of a vessel, judging its strength by touch rather than sight. A carpenter listens to the tone a plank makes when struck lightly, sensing hidden imperfections in its grain. Even the farmers, who spent most of their days tending fields, carried enough inherited knowledge to help fit the pieces together. Something about this communal work creates a different kind of structure, one that feels alive rather than assembled. Every person brings a memory. A roof that collapsed in a storm years ago, a beam that twisted because the tree had been cut too early, a joint that held for decades because it had been carved a certain way. These memories form a collective blueprint more powerful than anything drawn on paper. and as axes rise and fall, sending curls of wood drifting through the cold air, the house slowly takes shape under a chorus of shared experience. There is no rush. Timber is examined, turned, rejected, or kept. Angles are adjusted by quiet instinct, not numbers. The builders trust nature enough to let it guide them. A beam that curves slightly is not discarded. It is placed where its shape lends strength. A knot in the wood is not a flaw but a signal to shift a joint by a finger's width. Everything is done with patience, as if each decision might echo for generations. The scent of fresh pine mixes with the smell of earth. Voices murmur in low conversation, blending with the thud of tools and the distant call of seabirds. In these moments, the Viking home becomes more than wood and labor. It becomes a vessel of memory, shaped by people who understood materials not through theory, but through a lifetime of watching how they behaved in fire, frost, and rain. Modern builders measured twice and cut once. Viking builders observed twice and remembered always. Their methods may seem imprecise to us, yet the roofs they raised outlasted storms that splinter our engineered structures. And that quiet paradox leads us toward the next layer of the mystery. The materials themselves, chosen with care, so deliberate it feels almost hidden. If you follow the trail of the Viking roof back to its origins, it doesn't lead you to a construction site. It leads you into the forest, quiet, ancient, and patient in a way that human hands rarely are. Long before a single beam was shaped, the Vikings began their work beneath the shadows of towering pines and spruces. And the first hidden clue to their extraordinary roofing lies in the way they walked through those woods, studying each tree as if it were an old acquaintance whose moods and secrets they already half understood. Winter was the season of selection, a choice that seems almost accidental until you look closer. When the cold tightened its grip and the sap retreated deep into the heart of the trees, the Vikings took up their axes. Cutting timber in winter gave wood a stability that modern machines struggle to imitate. Less sap meant less moisture. Less moisture meant timber that resisted rot and warping. It was as if the forest itself hardened under frost, offering its strongest version only to those patient enough to wait for the right moment. Imagine the sound of an axe striking frozen wood, sharp, clean, echoing through the stillness. Each tree was chosen not merely for size, but for age straightness and the way it had endured storms. A tree twisted by wind would be used where a curve was needed. One that grew slowly in thin soil produced a tight, resilient grain. The builders read these signs the way others read weather or tides, sensing which trees would last longer than their lifetimes. And there was a ritualistic calm in the process. Trees were not taken in haste. They were walked around, touched, judged with the respect reserved for something that would one day shelter a family from the same storms that shaped it. Even after felling, the logs were left to rest in the cold, allowing the winter air to begin a natural curing process that modern kilns mimic, but never quite recreate. This careful timing, this harmony with seasonal rhythm, is the first clue to the Viking secret. It wasn't tool strength or material abundance that made their roofs endure. It was patience, an understanding that the forest gives different answers depending on when you ask. Today, we cut lumber year-round, dry it rapidly with heat, and treat it as uniform. But the Vikings knew better. They saw that wood harvested at the wrong moment would betray you in the first difficult season. If you stand in those ancient woods long enough, You begin to feel it, the sense that the trees taught the builders more than any master could. And once the timber was chosen, seasoned by cold and silence, the true work began. That path leads us deeper into the mystery, toward the remarkable ways this wood was shaped, prepared, and transformed into something nearly indestructible. And it is in that next chapter that the full picture of Viking durability begins to emerge. Winter in the north has a silence that feels older than memory, a stillness so deep that every sound seems to travel farther than it should. It was in this silence that Viking builders began their work, wandering through forests glazed with frost, studying the trunks of pines and spruces as if each one carried a private message. They knew the trees were different in winter, tightened by cold, drained of sap, hardened by the season's quiet discipline. When an axe met frozen wood, the fibers yielded cleanly, without the wet softness that weakened timber taken in warmer months. This was the first step in creating lumber that refused to rot, warp, or split, even when storms tried their best to undo it. Modern builders lean on kilns, schedules, and supply chains, but the Vikings trusted cycles instead. They understood that a tree cut too early held water like a burden, and that trapped moisture became an invitation for decay. So they waited. They watched the forests grow brittle with cold, and only then did they choose which trunks would someday become beams, strong enough to shoulder a roof. Older trees, shaped by slow growth in thin soil, offered tight grain that shrugged off water. Younger trees, taller and straighter, served where flexibility mattered more. Every choice matched a future purpose. Walking among them, you might imagine the builders testing the bark, peering at the angle of a branch, listening to the faint creak of a trunk swaying beneath snow. Nothing was random. A tree bowed by years of wind carried a curve that could be turned into structural advantage. Another, standing stubbornly alone on rocky ground, had fibers dense enough to resist the creeping touch of moisture. These qualities were not taught in any formal way. They were learned through winters survived, repairs remembered, and failures whispered as quiet warnings. There is a strangeness in realizing how closely this old wisdom shadows modern science. Today, we analyze moisture content and grain density with calibrated tools. Yet the Vikings reached similar conclusions simply by observing nature with patient eyes. Their choices feel almost mystical until you understand the pattern. Nature performs its own craftsmanship during winter, drying and strengthening what it has grown. The builders merely arrived at the right moment to accept the gift. In that frozen forest, the secret of their enduring roofs began long before a single beam was shaped. And as the chosen logs lay curing beneath the cold sky, the next stage waited, where hands, not seasons, would refine the wood even further, giving it a resilience that modern tools rarely achieve. That quiet transformation marked the shift from nature's work to human intention. In the dim light of winter afternoons, builders gathered the selected timber, sensing the strength hidden beneath its chilled surface. Each log promised a future roof that would stand against storms yet to come. And from this careful beginning, the shaping of the timber could finally unfold. Its purpose was becoming clear. When the Vikings carried their winter-felled logs back to the village, the real work began, not with saws buzzing through the wood, but with broad axes rising and falling in a patient rhythm. Their shaping was slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Each stroke followed the natural line of the grain, coaxing the timber into beams rather than forcing it into shape. The curls of wood that drifted to the ground were soft and pale, revealing the clean inner fibers left intact beneath the blade. It was a method that demanded time and strength, yet it gave the wood something modern tools rarely leave behind: integrity. Saws slice straight across the grain, tearing through fibers in a way that weakens them. But an ag guided by instinct rather than measurement preserves the direction the tree grew in. The Vikings recognized that a beam made this way shed water more easily, the grain guiding moisture outward like tiny channels. The compressed surface left by the axe blows hardened into a natural armor, resistant to rot and eager to endure. This wasn't simply technique. It was a quiet conversation with the material itself, as if the builders were negotiating rather than commanding. In the calm of a northern morning, you could hear this dialogue unfolding. The thud of an axe landing with steady force, the gentle crack as fibers parted, the murmured comments of builders feeling the weight of each section, judging whether to remove more or let the curve remain. They weren't shaping the wood into straight, obedient lines, they were uncovering the shape that already lived inside it. A beam curved by decades of wind belonged in a place where that curve added strength. A piece with a knot could be fitted where tension was lowest. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was forced. Watching them, it becomes clear why their roofs survived so long. Their methods allowed the timber to breathe and move. When the seasons shifted, the beams swelled gently, contracting again when warmth returned, never fighting against their own nature. Modern lumber, cut quickly and uniformly, often splits under the same conditions, its fibers severed and unable to cooperate with moisture. The Viking approach created harmony instead of conflict, a principle modern builders rarely consider. As the beams took shape, a sense of purpose settled over the workspace. These weren't merely parts of a house. They were living elements prepared to face the storms ahead. The builders worked without urgency, trusting the pace of tradition more than the pressure of time. Every stroke of the axe carried echoes of older hands that had taught them, and those echoes guided the wood into forms capable of surviving generations. When the shaping was finally complete, each beam held a quiet strength, a resilience earned through patient attention. Now the timber was ready for the next stage, one that would deepen its endurance even further. The builders would soon call on fire, smoke, and resin to protect the wood, sealing it against the world it would soon confront. Once the timber had been shaped, the Vikings turned to a different kind of craftsmanship, one that blended patience, fire, and the strange alchemy of nature itself. They understood that wood, no matter how carefully chosen and carved, needed protection from the world it would soon face. Rain, insects, rot, time all waited to claim it. So the builders prepared their defenses in the same way they prepared everything else. Slowly, deliberately, and in harmony with elements older than memory. At the center of this ritual was pine tar, a substance that seemed almost magical in its ability to preserve what it touched. To create it, they built pits in the ground, lined with stones to withstand heat. Resin-rich wood was stacked carefully, then buried beneath turf so that only a narrow opening remained. Fire was coaxed into the chamber, not to burn the wood outright, but to smolder it in a slow, oxygen-starved whisper. Hours passed this way, sometimes days. Thick, dark tar seeped downward through the timber, collected in clay pots below and cooled into a glossy liquid that carried the scent of forest and smoke. This tar held qualities that resisted moisture with surprising strength, and the Vikings brushed it generously onto their beams until every surface gleamed. The process felt almost ceremonial. The flame flickered behind layers of soil, the ground exhaling warm breath into the cold northern air. Builders crouched around pots of tar, dipping brushes made from animal hair and dragging them across the wood in long, smooth strokes. The scent filled their workshops, sweet, sharp, earthy, and it sank deep into the freshly hewn fibers. It did more than coat the timber, it bonded with it, creating a barrier that repelled fungus and insects with remarkable persistence. But tar was only part of their preservation. Smoke curing added another layer of endurance. Inside longhouses, beams hung above the central hearth, where fires burned day and night. Over weeks and months, smoke curled upward, carrying microscopic particles that settled into the pores of the wood. The beams darkened, hardened, and became richly seasoned by the constant haze. What began as pole timber gradually turned into something closer to stone, smooth, tough, fused with compounds that resisted decay. This smoke did more than preserve. It sterilized. Microbes died before they had a chance to take hold. Moisture evaporated from the heat rising continually toward the rafters. Even in the coldest months, the interior climate of the home created conditions that strengthened the wood instead of weakening it. The result was timber that had already lived through a lifetime of protection before it ever touched the roofline. By the time each beam was ready, it carried layers of defense: sun-hardened grain, winter seasoning, tar-blackened armor, and smoke-borne resilience. These weren't mere planks. They were materials transformed by the ritual and necessity, prepared to join a structure that would face relentless storms. And when these preserved beams met the unique design of Viking roofing, another hidden secret emerged. A structural pattern waiting beneath a collapsed hall to be rediscovered centuries later. The secret did not emerge from a manuscript or an old tale whispered through the generations. It surfaced from silence. Beneath a collapsed Viking hall buried under layers of soil and forgotten seasons. When archaeologists uncovered the structure in the early 20th century, they expected little more than rotted timber and scattered debris. Instead, they found something that felt almost deliberate in its concealment: a hidden pattern preserved by centuries of darkness. As the earth was brushed away, an unexpected truth appeared. The rafters beneath the hall had been arranged in a way no one anticipated, locked in a lattice that defied the assumptions of modern building. The beams were not placed in simple parallel lines as contemporary roofs often are. They crossed, interlocked, and formed a subtle geometry reminiscent of the ribs of a ship. Each member supported the next, distributing stress across the whole structure, rather than allowing weight to rest on a single burdened point. Even after centuries underground, the pattern was unmistakable. The wood, darkened by time but still recognizable, revealed a logic that had gone unnoticed for generations. The builders had designed a system where every failure was already accounted for, every weakness compensated by another piece quietly carrying the load. Standing above the excavation, one could imagine the hall as it once was, its roof rising against storms, its beams flexing together as one living body. The discovery suggested that Viking builders did not simply construct homes. They built frameworks with the same principles that guided their legendary ships. The curved beams that once met waves now met winter winds. The interlocked joints that held hulls firm during voyages across the North Atlantic held roofs steady under mountains of snow. These similarities were not coincidence. They revealed a shared understanding. Survival depended on cooperation between every part of the structure. This lattice design also served another purpose. Its angles allowed water to travel away from vulnerable points, guiding runoff toward edges where it could drip harmlessly into the soil. Even if one beam absorbed too much moisture or weakened with time, the network of supports ensured that no single flaw became catastrophic. It was a safeguard modern roofs rarely possess, relying instead on uniform materials that fail suddenly when one point is breached. As archaeologists mapped the beams, a quiet realization settled over them. This was not improvisation. It was intentional engineering, preserved in dirt rather than ink. These builders, without formal blueprints, created a roof system that behaved like an organism, flexible, balanced, capable of withstanding forces that would crush rigid structures. The fallen hall, once a casualty of time, had become a messenger. Its collapse revealed what its life had concealed. This discovery bridged the gap between wood selection, preservation rituals, and structural mastery. And with this hidden pattern brought back to light, the story turns upward toward the final layer, the living, breathing shield that crowned every Viking home. The next chapter reveals how these carefully crafted beams supported a roof unlike anything most modern builders have ever seen. Before a Viking roof could rise into its final form, the builders turned their attention to the rafters, the quiet foundation that determined whether the entire structure would survive its first winter. These pieces of timber, shaped by hand and chosen with care, were never forced into perfect symmetry. Instead, the rafters followed the natural curves of the trees from which they were taken, allowing each piece to retain the strength it had gathered through years of wind, frost, and slow growth. When the beams were lifted into place, their bends formed subtle arches, gentle enough to seem accidental, yet strong enough to shoulder immense weight. A modern roof often fights against the elements, relying on straight boards cut from uniform lumber. The Viking roof moved with the world around it. As winter storms rolled across the north, winds howled against the longhouses, rattling doors and slipping through the narrow gaps between wall planks. Snow gathered on the rooftops in heavy layers, pressing downwards until the beams groaned softly in the darkness. But instead of cracking, the rafters flexed. They shifted together like muscles beneath a living body, redistributing the weight until no single point bore more than it could carry. Inside the home, families would hear it. The faint creaking overhead, the sound of a structure adjusting itself under pressure, not failing, but responding. The rafters were spaced with intention, never too far apart, never aligned in ways that encouraged weakness. Each beam supported not only the roof, but its neighboring rafters, creating a network of shared burden. This design ensured that if one piece strained under the load, the rest leaned into their roles, easing the tension. It was a kind of cooperation built into the wood itself, a quiet agreement between every part of the structure. The Vikings trusted imperfection in ways that feel foreign today. They understood that nature rarely grows in straight lines, and that a curved tree offered resilience no perfectly milled plank could match. Modern builders remove these quirks, stripping wood down until nothing remains but uniformity. But in that pursuit of perfection, something vital is lost: the ability to bend instead of break. The Vikings allowed the grain to guide the work, and in doing so, created frames that knew how to survive. Storm after storm, the rafters settled into their purpose. They arched downward under heavy snow, then rose again as the thaw began. They absorbed the force of wind that would peel modern shingles away in sheets. They behaved like parts of a single organism, adjusting to the season's every demand. And because of this, the layer above them, the one that would carry water away and shield the home from rain, had a foundation worthy of its task. With the rafters set and the structure ready to breathe under the northern sky, the next step awaited. A strange and elegant material that modern builders seldom consider, yet one the Vikings trusted as their primary defense against the storm. Birch bark, thin, pale, and deceptively strong, was about to transform the roof into something remarkable. Long before the sod was laid, long before the roof became the familiar green shape blending into the northern hills, the Vikings placed a layer so delicate in appearance that its strength feels almost impossible. Birch bark, thin, pale, and papery, was their chosen shield against the one enemy no home can escape: water. At first glance, it seems too fragile for the task. But when harvested with care, when cut in wide sheets, and handled with calm precision, birch bark reveals a nature far more resilient than its surface suggests. The process began in the quiet months of early summer, when the sap loosened the bond between bark and wood. Builders approached the trees with the same respect they brought to every part of their craft. They peeled the bark in long, careful strips, ensuring the inner tree remained unharmed and free to grow again. Each sheet carried a silvery sheen, smooth to the touch, with natural oils that repelled moisture as if the bark remembered centuries of rain slipping across its surface. When the sheets dried, they became tough and flexible. Laid across the curved rafters, they crackled softly, like parchment shifting beneath a gentle hand. Layer after layer overlapped, each piece tucked beneath the next, in a pattern that shed water the way a bird's feathers shed rain. As the builders worked, the roof began to whisper with the rustle of bark edges settling into place. It was a quiet, almost meditative sound, soft, deliberate, and full of promise. What made birch bark extraordinary was not just its natural resistance to water, but its ability to change with the weather. When rain came, the bark fibers swelled, tightening the seams until the entire surface became nearly seamless. When the sun returned, the bark relaxed again, never warping, never splitting, simply adjusting to whatever the season demanded. Modern roofing materials crack under these cycles. Asphalt hardens, then crumbles. Synthetic layers peel or buckle. But birch bark, created by nature to endure the northern climate, accepted each change as part of its design. Beneath the bark, the rafters flexed as storms pressed against the structure. Above it, the bark shifted subtly, sealing itself with each breath of moisture. This living interplay between wood and membrane formed a defense more reliable than many modern roofing systems built with far more complexity. The bark needed no nails, no adhesives, no manufactured treatments. Its strength came from the forest itself, and the Vikings simply listened to what the trees had already learned. As the final layers were laid, the roof took on its first form: a waterproof skin ready to face rain, melting snow, and relentless winds funneling through the fjords. And yet, the bark was only the beginning. Its pale surface would soon disappear beneath something heavier, something alive, something that carried the weight of the earth itself. The next stage transformed the roof from a simple structure into a living shield. And it is here that the true genius of Viking architecture reveals itself. Once the birch bark had settled into its quiet silver layers, the Vikings introduced an element that seemed almost impossible for a roof. A layer of earth itself. Thick, heavy, taken from pastures and meadow edges, the sod was carried in blocks and laid across the bark as if the builders were wrapping the home in a living cloak. At first glance, it appeared crude, almost improvised. But nothing about this choice was accidental. The sod transformed the roof into something far more resilient than its parts. A shield drawn from the soil that fed their crops and grounded their world. The weight of the sod pressed downward, anchoring the birch bark beneath it. This pressure was not a burden, but a blessing. It tightened the bark's seams, locking the waterproof layer into place with a force that no wind could lift. Each block of sod held its own moisture, its own roots, its own dense network of fibers that interlaced like woven fabric. When rain fell, the water did not rush across the surface. It disappeared slowly into the soil, moving through it at a pace nature set rather than the storm. The sod absorbed the excess, released it gently, and protected the bark from sudden surges. Inside these blocks of earth, life continued. Grass blades settled into new positions, their roots entwining with one another to create a mat dense enough to hold together under the harshest conditions. In winter, this living layer insulated the home below, trapping heat and softening the bite of the cold. In summer, it kept the longhouse cool, the earth absorbing sunlight that would otherwise have beaten down on the roof. Modern insulation comes in rolls and sheets, precise and uniform, yet it rarely achieves such effortless harmony with the seasons. A surprising truth lay in the nature of the roots themselves. While one might expect them to pierce downward, threatening the birch bark, the opposite occurred. Birch bark, filled with natural oils, resisted intrusion. The roots skirted along its surface instead, weaving together horizontally to form a dense, anchored blanket. This living mat distributed weight across the rafters, allowing snow to gather without overwhelming any single point. When storms piled heavy drifts on top, the sod compressed slightly, adjusting itself the way a field yields under fresh snowfall. Viewed from afar, these roofs seemed to rise from the earth like low hills, blending seamlessly into the landscape. They looked ancient even when newly built, as if the land itself had lifted to protect the home beneath. Birds landed on them. Wildflowers found quiet corners to grow. Moss spread in soft patches along the edges. A modern roof deteriorates with every season. A Viking sod roof grew stronger as life took root on its surface. And all this weight, all this quiet life, rested on the birch bark and the curved rafters below, forming layers that worked not in isolation, but in harmony. Yet the full brilliance of this system emerged only when all parts were seen together. A symphony of wood, bark, and earth designed to outsmart the storms. That final harmony awaits in the next part of the story. When the storm swept across the northern world, the Viking roof did not rely on a single defense. Its strength emerged from the quiet cooperation of every layer, each one answering what the others could not. The rafters bent beneath the weight of snow, lowering like the ribs of a great animal settling into rest. The birch bark tightened as the first drops of rain struck its surface, swelling gently until its seams sealed themselves shut. Above it all, the sod absorbed the storm's force. softening the blow before the water even reached the membrane below. Each layer moved on its own, yet together they formed a structure that felt almost sentient, responding to the world as it changed moment by moment. Inside the longhouse, the family would hear the voice of this cooperation. When winds pushed against the roof, they heard the creak of rafters shifting with intention, not strain. When heavy snow settled across the sod, they felt the weight redistribute through beams designed to handle more than any single winter could bring. Even the sound of rain was softened by the living soil above, turning what might have been a relentless drumbeat into a low, calming murmur. The home breathed with the storm instead of resisting it. Modern roofs fail because they rely on rigidity. A single nail rusts, a shingle warps, a membrane tears, and suddenly the entire system collapses. The Vikings built their roofs as networks, where no one part was expected to endure alone. The sod's mass stabilized the bark protected the beams flexed to shield everything above. This interdependence created a kind of resilience that could not be engineered through uniform materials or perfect measurements. It was the resilience of natural systems, messy, flexible, and profoundly effective. The tar-treated beams beneath it all played a quiet role. They resisted the slow creep of moisture the way a seasoned tree endures years of rain. They refused to rot, even as seasons cycled endlessly overhead. Smoke from the hearth seeped into their grain, adding invisible layers of preservation. Nothing about these ingredients was extraordinary on its own. But when fitted together, they behaved like a fortress disguised as a farmhouse. As storms grew stronger, the roof did not weaken. It adapted. Snow pressed down. The rafters bowed enough to relieve tension. Sudden rains soaked the sod. Roots and soil slowed the water's descent. The bark swelled and sealed. The beams held firm. Every part compensated for the others, correcting small failures before they became true threats. This was not architecture that chased perfection. It was architecture that trusted cooperation over control. And so the roof survived seasons that shattered modern structures. It was never a single innovation, but the harmony of many small decisions, each shaped by centuries of watching nature and learning how to work beside it. With this understanding, the story now shifts from materials and technique to the people behind them, the culture, beliefs, and worldviews that shaped such remarkable designs. When a Viking home was built, it never began with a single carpenter lifting a single beam. It began with the sound of footsteps across frozen soil, with neighbors arriving one by one, their breath rising in white clouds as morning light clung to the fields. A home was not a private undertaking. It belonged to the village long before the first post was set. Men and women gathered with axes, ropes, and quiet determination, knowing that the strength of the new roof would one day shelter not only a family, but the memory of their shared survival. In the open air, work moved with a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. Elders checked the timbers, running their fingers across the grain, muttering reminders about trees cut in past winters. Younger builders listened carefully, absorbing the lessons that had shaped homes long before they were born. Shipwrights, accustomed to bending planks for boats, examined the curved beams and directed where each should lie. Farmers brought sod from their fields, choosing patches with the densest roots, knowing those roots would one day hold the roof steady against storms. Nothing about the scene suggested haste. The villagers sharpened axes beside smoking cook fires, the scent of pine mingling with the smell of roasting meat. Children carried small branches and tools. Dogs wandered between the workers, tails swaying lazily. Each person had a role, and each role held meaning. No one questioned whether they should be there. Helping build a roof was as natural as gathering food or preparing for winter. A weak roof for one family meant danger for the entire settlement. A strong roof meant safety shared by all. Mistakes rarely lasted long. When a young builder tried to fit a beam too quickly, an elder would lift his hand and guide the correction without a hint of impatience. This passing of knowledge kept errors from becoming structural weaknesses. It also ensured that even the newest hands carried generations of experience. The villagers built slowly, not because they lacked skill, but because precision grew from shared memory, not from speed. There was unity in the sounds that filled the village, axes thudding into timber, voices rising in low conversation, the scrape of bark peeled away, the deep breath of wind coming down from the fjords. These sounds blended into something steady, comforting, and deeply human. A Viking roof was not shaped by a single craftsperson's vision, but by the collective rhythm of people who understood how deeply they relied on one another. The finished structure held more than wood. It held fingerprints, laughter, arguments, advice, and stories. It carried the identity of the community itself. And in that sense, the strength of the roof came as much from the hands that built it as from the materials beneath them. This shared labor set the stage for another layer of meaning, one woven not from effort, but from belief. For the Vikings saw their roofs not only as communal achievements, but as sacred shields placed between their families and the mysteries above. To the Vikings, a roof was never just a structure keeping snow at bay. It was something closer to a boundary between worlds, a handmade horizon separating the fragile lives within from forces far older than humanity. Every beam, every joint, every sweep of bark and sod carried echoes of beliefs that shaped their understanding of safety. In their eyes, the sky was powerful, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, and the roof was the only thing standing between the warmth of the hearth and the vast, unpredictable realm above. Building it was both a craft and a quiet act of devotion. Long before the roof was lifted into place, villagers gathered at dusk, the air glowing with the soft amber of torchlight. Elders arrived murmuring old blessings, carving runes into the chosen beams with slow, careful strokes. These symbols invited protection, not through superstition, but through memory, each rune reminding the household of the gods who governed storms, seasons, and the fragile balance of life. The marks sank into the wood like whispered promises, carried forward by hands that believed deeply in the power of intention. Sometimes an offering was made. A small cut of meat, a cup of warm mead, a few drops of animal blood brushed onto a post. The smoke from the hearth or the fire pit curled around these offerings, rising through the half-built rafters as if carrying the villagers' hopes upward. The scent of pine resin, heated by flame, drifted through the gathering darkness. The moment felt strangely still, as though the world paused to listen. To outsiders, these acts might appear as ritual for ritual's sake. But for the Vikings, they created a deep sense of reassurance. A home was a sacred space, a place where families grew, where ancestors were remembered, where life continued despite the harshness outside. The roof symbolized this sanctuary more than any wall or door could. It was the lid that held their world together. Treating it casually would have felt like inviting chaos into the hearth fire. Even the act of raising the roof carried symbolic weight. As the rafters were lifted, villagers stood beneath them, watching their future shelter rise overhead, like the branches of an earthly Yggdrasil. In Norse myth, that great tree stretched across creation, shielding all living beings beneath its vast limbs. The roof, shaped from forest wood and protected by layers of bark and soil, echoed that cosmic structure in miniature. To sleep beneath it was to feel part of a larger ordered world. Because of this belief, shortcuts were unthinkable. A poorly set beam wasn't merely a construction flaw. It was a breach in the shield meant to guard a family's life. Every mistake carried spiritual weight, and every correction reaffirmed their commitment to protection. This reverence ensured the work was slow, careful, and deeply personal. With the roof spiritually anchored, daily life began beneath its shadow. Firelight, smoke, laughter, and long nights of winter all played roles in shaping both the home and the wood above it. And within that lived reality, a surprising form of preservation was happening. One the builders may not have fully understood, yet depended on all the same. Life beneath a Viking roof unfolded in a world shaped by firelight and drifting smoke. Inside the longhouse, the hearth rarely went cold. Flames crackled softly through winter days, and even more fiercely through winter nights, their glow flickering across wooden walls darkened by years of soot. The air carried a warm heaviness, scented with pine tar and the faint sweetness of burning peat. Everything beneath that roof, food, rest, stories, arguments, births, deaths, happened under a constant haze rising upward toward the beams. At first glance, the longhouse interior might seem harsh by modern standards. Smoke wandered freely across the rafters before slipping out through a small opening high in the roof. Warm, humid air gathered near the ceiling, while cold air crept in near the floor. Yet this imperfect environment quietly performed a kind of ongoing preservation. Every day, the smoke curled around the beams, carrying microscopic particles that clung to the wood like a protective film. Over time, these layers hardened into a dark sheen that sealed the timber against moisture and decay. What irritated the eyes also strengthened the home. Even the warmth played its part. Modern houses often seal themselves so tightly that humidity becomes a hidden enemy. Water vapor collects in corners, behind walls, inside roofs, inviting mold and rot. But the Viking longhouse breathed. Its gaps allowed air to circulate. Its open hearth dried the interior throughout the day. Humidity rose only to be swept away by winds and and slipping through the walls, or consumed by the heat of the fire. The roof beams, resting just above this warm, moving air, avoided the condensation that plagues modern insulated spaces. Families gathered near the hearth, listening to the crackling flames while storms raged outside. Shadows danced across the rafters, revealing how smoke drifted in slow, curling ribbons around the beams. No one realized that this quiet dance was adding decades to the life of the roof. The creosote-like residue repelled insects and fungi, creating an environment too dry, too hot, and too smoky for decay to find a foothold. Every dinner cooked over the fire. Every story told late into the night. Every ember floating upward contributed to the home's endurance. In summer, when fires burned lower and daylight stretched long across the sky, the house warmed more gently. Smoke levels dropped, but the beams had already absorbed months of resin-laced air. The patterns of exposure, the intense smoke of a winter, the mild warmth of summer, created a rhythm that conditioned the wood like a long, slow curing process. No one engineered it, no one measured it. Life itself provided the chemistry. It is strange to think that what modern homes try desperately to avoid, smoke, drafts, temperature shifts, once kept roofs strong enough to withstand generations. Beneath the Viking roof, practicality blended effortlessly with the ordinary patterns of living. And when viewed alongside their beliefs and communal practices, a picture emerges of a culture that shaped its architecture in ways deeper than craft alone. That connection between climate, tradition, and worldview becomes even clearer as the final piece of their cultural framework comes into view. Across the northern world, where winter ruled more months than it spared, the Vikings learned early that survival depended on listening to the land rather than defying it. Their beliefs, traditions, and everyday routines grew from this understanding, shaping not only how they lived, but how they built. The roof, more than any other part of the home, reflected this quiet philosophy. It was the meeting point between human shelter and the vast, shifting sky. A reminder that the forces above could never truly be controlled, only respected. In a climate where storms carved new lessons into memory each year, the Vikings developed a worldview that blended observation with reverence. Snow that crushed a poorly built roof wasn't just misfortune. It was instruction. A longhouse that stayed warm through the coldest nights wasn't simply well designed. It was aligned with the world that created it. Over generations, these lessons merged with their stories and beliefs until practical wisdom and cultural meaning became impossible to separate. Their mythology reflected the same truth. They imagined the world sheltered beneath the branches of Yggdrasil, a cosmic tree whose limbs held the heavens apart from the realm of mortals. Beneath those branches, all life found its place. When they built roofs shaped from forest wood, layered with bark and soil, they were unknowingly echoing that grand structure. The roof became a smaller world tree, shielding the home just as Yggdrasil shielded existence. Belief didn't dictate the design, but it infused it with a sense of purpose. This connection encouraged care rather than shortcuts. A roof built with haste wasn't only a structural risk. It felt like a breach in the invisible order that held their world together. Every decision, from the angle of a rafter to the placement of sod, reflected the understanding that nature wasn't an obstacle. It was a partner. The Vikings didn't try to keep moisture out at all costs. They guided it. They didn't try to dominate the cold. They insulated against it with earth and smoke. They didn't try to silence the wind. They shaped their roofs so the wind's force slid harmlessly across them. While modern building often separates engineering from lifestyle, the Vikings lived in a seamless blend of both. Their homes were as much expressions of their worldview as their rituals or runestones. Climate shaped belief. Belief shaped craft. Craft shaped survival. It was a loop so natural they may never have realized how deeply it informed their decisions. Even today, echoes of that philosophy remain visible across Scandinavia, in the value placed on simplicity, in the emphasis on harmony with nature, in the quiet pride craftsmen feel when something is built to last. The Viking roof stands as a reminder that technology alone does not create resilience. Perspective does. And with their worldview now woven into the story, the narrative turns toward the next layer of mystery. How these cultural principles transformed into engineering decisions that still challenge modern understanding. Before a Viking roof ever touched the sky, the builders stood quietly beside the rising frame, reading the structure the way others read weathered sagas. They had no parchment filled with formulas, no charcoal sketched blueprints, no symbols to calculate forces or angles. Instead, their understanding came from years of watching snow gather on rooftops, seeing storms bend trees in particular directions, and noticing how water curved along wood in ways that seemed almost alive. Their calculations lived in memory, not in ink, and the results were often more accurate than the numbers we trust today. A builder would stand beneath the half-formed roof and run his fingers along a rafter, feeling for tension the way a musician feels the pull of a string. He would tilt his head, listening for the faint crackle inside the beam that warned of hidden weakness. To an outsider, it looked like guesswork. But these movements were learned through winters that broke weaker homes and summers that revealed where the snowmelt traveled fastest. The slope of the roof, the spacing of the beams, the angle where two rafters crossed. Each was chosen through long observation, not academic measurement. In places where snow fell heavy and wet, the roofs angled steeply so that the drifts slid away before they grew dangerous. In windy coastal regions, the pitch flattened just enough to keep fierce gusts from prying the materials loose. Homes built near river valleys leaned slightly in the direction that drained water most naturally. Every village, every landscape, every weather pattern left its own imprint on the design. Where modern construction often imposes the same roof profile across wildly different climates, Viking roofs were shaped to belong exactly where they stood. This intuitive engineering created structures that felt strangely alive during storms. When the first snows arrived, the builders watched how the white blanket settled, adjusting angles on new homes if drifts gathered too heavily. If water lingered in a certain corner after rain, they learned from it. If a previous roof cracked during a violent winter, that failure became instruction for every house raised afterward. Nothing was wasted. Everything was studied. Their engineering was not written in numbers, but in seasons. It is unsettling to realize how much precision grew from this unwritten method. A modern roof often relies on exact measurements and standardized lumber, yet fails when climate overwhelms those expectations. The Viking approach favored responsiveness over rigidity, adaptation over uniformity. They trusted the land to teach them how steep was steep enough, how wide was stable enough, and how much flex the beams needed to survive the next storm. Their knowledge lived not in calculations, but in eyes that studied the horizon, in hands that felt the rise and fall of timber under pressure, in memories of roofs that endured and those that collapsed. And with this silent mathematics guiding every decision, they moved naturally toward the next great challenge: how to guide the rain once it reached the roof. Not by resisting it, but by shaping its path through a system that understood movement better than stillness. When the first drops of rain touched a Viking roof, they were not met with resistance. They were guided, invited into a quiet journey shaped by wood, bark, and soil. Unlike modern roofs, which try to repel every drop with rigid layers that fail all at once when breached, the Viking system relied on cooperation. Water was not an intruder to fight. It was a guest to redirect. Each layer of the roof played its part, turning storms into something manageable rather than something feared. The sod greeted the rain first. Thick and spongy, it absorbed the initial surge the way earth absorbs a passing cloudburst. Grass blades trembled beneath the falling water, and the soil beneath them swelled slightly, holding moisture instead of letting it race downward. This slow absorption prevented the violent runoff that cuts channels into modern roofs and erodes their foundations. The sod drank calmly, releasing the excess only when it was ready. Once the water passed through this living layer, it met the birch bark. Still, bright and deceptively thin. The bark refused to let any drop sink deeper. Instead, the water ran across it, sliding along the natural oils that made birch bark so resistant to decay. The sheets overlapped like the scales of a fish, guiding every droplet outward. Rather than trapping moisture, the bark encouraged it to move, offering no place for stagnant pools to form. Even the smallest seam swelled shut when wet, tightening instinctively. As the water traveled outward, and it reached the edge of the roof where the rafters extended beyond the walls. These long eaves created the final stage of the journey. They pushed water far enough from the structure that it fell harmlessly to the ground instead of slipping down the walls or soaking the foundation. There were no gutters to clog, no metal flashings to corrode, no membranes to tear. Only wood shaped by understanding and bark shaped by nature. Inside the longhouse, the family could hear the rain shifting above them. A soft patter turning into a distant drip as water left the roof course in controlled streams. Nothing rushed. Nothing leaked. The entire system moved slowly, deliberately, as though the storm were being gently unwound by the architecture itself. Modern roofs fail because they place all trust in a single barrier. When that barrier tears, water claims the structure without hesitation. The Vikings built with humility, designing roofs that expected water to arrive and prepared multiple responses. If the sod became too saturated, the bark was waiting. If the bark weakened slightly with age, the rafters guided the flow outward. Redundancy formed a kind of quiet resilience. Every drop that touched a Viking roof was managed, not repelled. And it is here in this seemingly simple practice that another deeper truth emerges. The colder the climate grew, the more effectively this system performed. From controlling water, the roof now turned to controlling heat, and in doing so, revealed another hidden layer of ancient engineering brilliance. Long before anyone spoke of insulation, before diagrams showed how heat should travel through a home, the Vikings discovered a way to tame winters simply by placing the earth above their heads. The sod that blanketed their roofs was more than a protective layer. It was a slow, steady guardian of warmth. Thick blocks of soil and roots lay across the birch bark like a quilt drawn from the land itself. To an outsider, it may have looked heavy, even crude. But once the cold settled in, the brilliance of this choice revealed itself quietly, the way frost unmasks patterns on a window. On the coldest nights, when the wind braided itself through the fjords like a living rope, the inside of the longhouse remained surprisingly steady. That was the sod's secret. Each block held countless pockets of air between the roots, the soil, and the mingled strands of grass. These pockets trapped heat rising from the fire below, creating a natural barrier that slowed winter's bite. Snow piled atop the roof added even more insulation, forming a second layer that captured warmth instead of stealing it away. The more fierce the weather became outside, the more stubbornly the warmth settled within. Families gathered near the hearth, feeling the glow spread upward into the rafters. The fire crackled softly, its heat rising through the smoke-hazed air until it brushed against the timber beams. Beneath the sod, the birch bark never experienced the violent temperature swings that torment modern roofs. There were no freeze-thaw cycles splitting the bark or twisting the beams. Warmth stayed beneath the soil, held gently in place, and the wood aged slowly, predictably, without the stress of sudden change. This slow, constant warmth created a kind of equilibrium. The longhouse interior did not overheat, nor did it chill quickly when the fire dimmed. Instead, the temperature drifted in calm arcs, allowing the structure to breathe without strain. Modern roofs, thin and rigid, perform the opposite. They let heat escape rapidly in winter and invite it in during summer, forcing homes to battle the climate with machines rather than with design. The Vikings, without planning it in technical terms, had built an early form of climate control, silent, passive, and profoundly effective. There was a quiet elegance in how simple it all was. No insulation rolls, no vapor barriers, no calculated R values. Just earth, roots, and snow working together as if nature had designed them for that exact purpose. The sod did not weaken with time. In fact, it grew denser, its roots thickening into a firmer mat each year. As it matured, its insulating power increased. The roof aged like a living companion, becoming wiser and more resilient with every passing season. And as the sod guarded the warmth below, another secret lay waiting in the beams themselves. A lesson in strength hidden in curves, not in straight lines. The Vikings did not rely on rigid perfection. They trusted the natural shapes of wood, allowing their roofs to move, bend, and survive storms that would snap modern structures in half. When storms swept over the northern world, modern builders might imagine a roof stiffening itself against the force, bracing with all its might in hopes of outlasting the wind. The Vikings expected something different. They understood that rigidity invites breakage, and that perfection, the kind carved with straight lines and sharp corners, often collapses under pressure. So they chose another path. They allowed their roofs to move. The beams were shaped to follow the tree's original curves, creating a structure that bent like a living spine instead of a brittle shell. Inside the longhouse, a family could hear this movement during winter storms. Snow pressed down in deep, crushing layers. Wind clawed at the edges. The rafters responded with a soft, rhythmic creaking, shifting just enough to release the strain. Rather than snapping, the beams bowed gracefully, redistributing the weight across the entire lattice. Each curve supported the next. Each joint anchored its neighbor. This organic dance let the roof breathe under pressure, adjusting to every change the storm delivered. The house did not resist the storm. It flowed with it. Much of this resilience came from the joinery. The Vikings rarely relied on iron nails to lock their beams together. Nails rust, loosen, and create points of failure. Instead, they used wooden pegs and wedge joints carved precisely to grip tighter when wet. A joined beam, exposed to moisture, would swell into place rather than work itself loose. This meant that in the very moments modern roofs begin to fail, during heavy moisture or rapid temperature shifts, the Viking roof grew stronger. The environment that undermines modern houses reinforced theirs. Even the imperfections in the timber played a role. A twist in the grain might alarm a modern carpenter. But to a Viking builder, it suggested flexibility, a sign the beam could absorb shocks rather than resist them. Knots, curves, irregular tapers. Each was placed intentionally where its nature offered benefit. A curved beam became part of an arch. A thick knot found its position in a low-stress corner. The builders did not wage war against the material. They cooperated with it, allowing the tree's own history to influence the roof's future strength. And so, the structure behaved like something alive. When storms came, it rocked and settled. When snow melted, it rose again. When the air dried, the joints loosened slightly, only to tighten once more in the next rain. There was no single moment of stress that overwhelmed it. Every part compensated for the others. Where modern roofs snap, Viking roofs flexed. Where modern roofs fail suddenly, theirs adapted gradually. In this quiet flexibility lies one of the greatest secrets of their architectural longevity. The Vikings did not insist on control. They trusted movement. They trusted the imperfections of the wood, the swelling of moisture, the pressure of wind. And with this, their roofs survived storms that would have torn apart houses built with cleaner lines and sharper angles. Now that the engineering brilliance is illuminated, the story turns outward toward the environment itself and how these roofs aged, adapted, and endured across generations of unforgiving seasons. In the far north, where storms carve their names into the land, and winter arrives, like a long, unbroken sentence, the weather seems at first to be the villain of every story. Ice stiffens the rivers, snow buries the valleys, and winds sweep across the fjords with a force that can twist trees into unfamiliar shapes. Yet somehow, in this harsh landscape, the Viking roof thrived. It did more than survive the climate. It depended on it. What should have been its greatest enemy became its most reliable guardian, preserving the structure year after year in ways that feel almost counterintuitive. Cold was the first quiet ally. Fungus and rot, the slow destroyers of timber, demanded warmth to spread. Winter denied them that chance. Freezing temperatures locked decay in place, pausing the natural processes that would have eaten through the beams. Even in the warmer months, the nights cooled enough to keep biological threats sluggish. The wood aged slowly, its fibers strengthened by cycles of cold rather than weakened by them. Modern roofs, boxed into sealed insulation and artificial warmth, face microbial threats year-round. The Vikings let the climate work for them, not against them. Wind played its own unexpected role. Constant drafts swept across the rooftops, pulling moisture away before it could seep into the deeper layers. Where stagnant air might have encouraged rot, the restless northern winds kept the timber dry. Gusts funneled through fjords, brushing across the sod and birch bark, evaporating the remnants of each passing storm. Instead of fighting the wind, the Vikings built roofs that welcomed it, allowing air to move beneath and above the layers with ease. Snow, too, became a strange kind of friend. Heavy drifts settled across the sod, compressing it into a thicker, more unified blanket. Snow is often imagined as a burden, but in the north it became insulation. It sealed warmth in and shielded the sod from violent temperature swings. Each winter, the roof rested under this cold, soft weight, protected from the brittle freeze-thaw cycles that plague modern materials. When spring arrived, the slow melt trickled harmlessly through the soil, guided by the design rather than resisted by it. Inside the longhouse, the contrast was striking. While the landscape outside howled with icy storms, the home glowed with the orange warmth of the hearth. Smoke drifted upward, weaving between beams that had been shaped to flex with every gust. The cold sharpened the edges of the world outside, but within, the structure felt grounded and secure. That harmony, weather raging, roof adapting, was no coincidence. It was the result of centuries of learning how to live with the climate rather than attempting to conquer it. As seasons passed, the environment continued to shape and protect the roof. The structure did not just endure the weather, it was seasoned by it, strengthened by it, even perfected by it. And with time, something remarkable happened. The roofs began to change, not toward decay, but toward greater resilience. The true wonder of a Viking roof was not how well it performed when newly built, but how it changed with time. Most roofs begin dying the moment the final nail is hammered in. Weather chips at their edges, sun dries their surfaces, and moisture slips beneath their layers until age becomes a quiet enemy. But the Viking roof aged differently. It matured. With every passing year, it grew steadier, heavier, more grounded, becoming not a structure merely enduring the environment, but one shaped and improved by it. Above the birch bark, the sod layer thickened with each season. Roots spread outward, weaving into neighboring blocks until the entire surface formed a dense, intertwined mat. This living armor tightened under its own growth, locking the sod into a single cohesive blanket that resisted erosion and held moisture more evenly. Where modern roofs weaken under repeated exposure to water, this roof found balance. Moisture settled into the soil, stored temporarily, and then released slowly back into the air. Nothing rushed. Nothing soaked too deeply. The sod behaved like a natural regulator, smoothing out the rough edges of every storm. Beneath this evolving layer, the birch bark transformed as well. At first flexible and bright, it gradually flattened under the steady weight pressing into a more seamless membrane. The overlapping sheets fused tighter, their fibers responding to cycles of moisture and drying like a muscle learning its movements. With each year of compression and expansion, the bark became more unified, less prone to shifting, and even better at guiding water outward. Meanwhile, the tar that coated the beams hardened into something almost eternal. When first applied, pine tar was sticky and aromatic, seeping into the grain like warm sap. Over time, it cured into a dark, glossy shell that resisted insects, moisture, and decay. Every winter freeze and summer thaw strengthened this shell, reinforcing its grip on the timber. Instead of cracking or peeling, the tar became a permanent part of the wood, merging with it the way resin seals the wound of a living tree. Inside the longhouse, smoke continued its slow, unintentional work. Each winter added another faint layer of residue to the rafters, thin, nearly invisible, yet vital. These smoke-borne compounds seeped into microscopic pores, drying them, hardening them, and adding their own subtle protection. As the air warmed and cooled over the years, these layers settled deeper, creating a kind of internal armor that modern preservatives rarely match. All these changes, the thickening of roots, the tightening of bark, the curing of tar, the settling of smoke, carried the same effect. A structure that improved rather than deteriorated. Each storm strengthened its layers. Each winter sealed its joints. Each year bonded the materials into something closer to a single organism than a collection of parts. And as this living roof found its rhythm with time, the natural world around it offered unexpected support. Birds, moss, and microscopic life began quietly tending the surface, forming an ecosystem that protected the roof without a single human lift of the hand. Long after the builders had stepped away from the finished longhouse, another team arrived. One no human commanded, yet one that performed its duties with quiet precision. Nature sent its own caretakers to the Viking roof, each playing a role so subtle that generations might pass without anyone realizing what these small allies had accomplished. Together, they formed a living maintenance crew, tending the sod layer with a patience no craftsman could match. The first to arrive were the birds. Small, watchful, and endlessly curious, they hopped across the grass-covered surface in search of insects. Their lightweight steps pressed the sod just enough to settle loose soil, gently compacting it over time. As they hunted through the blades, they removed pests that might have burrowed into the roots. Their foraging acted as a natural cleaning ritual, preventing infestations long before they could threaten the roof's balance. To the birds, the roof was simply another meadow rising above the world. To the roof, the birds were quiet guardians. Moss soon followed. It crept in from shaded edges and cool corners, laying itself like a soft quilt across patches of exposed soil. Moss held moisture with surprising control, drinking in what the rain offered and releasing it only in thin, thoughtful breaths. This slow exchange prevented erosion, shielding the sod from being swept away during sudden downpours. It protected the birch bark below from abrupt temperature changes, wrapping the roof in a gentle layer that even the builders had not planned for. What began as decoration became reinforcement, a living buffer that grew thicker with each passing year. Beneath the surface, hidden from sight, microorganisms carried out tasks more essential than anyone could have guessed. Tiny decomposers broke down organic debris, transforming fallen leaves and dead roots into nutrient-rich soil. This kept the sod fertile and cohesive, ensuring that the root network grew stronger season after season. Their work prevented the buildup of material that might have clogged drainage or destabilized the soil. Instead, these microscopic laborers kept the system balanced, constantly renewing the sod layer without a single interruption. Together, these small creatures formed a cycle that required no supervision. Dew gathered at dawn, beading across moss and soil, feeding the roots that held the roof in place. Birds patrolled the surface, removing anything that threatened that delicate ecosystem. Microbes maintained the soil's structure, making sure it stayed light enough to drain yet dense enough to endure. No human hand could have orchestrated such harmony. The roof became a self-sustaining environment, strengthened by the very life that chose to live upon it. It is strange to think that modern roofs, with all their calculated designs and manufactured materials, rarely last as long as these surfaces tended by uninvited helpers. The Vikings built roofs that nature itself adopted and protected. And as this quiet partnership endured, some of these roofs outlasted entire settlements. This leads naturally to the final question. What remains of these ancient structures today, and what stories do the surviving fragments tell about a world that understood durability in ways we are only beginning to rediscover? Across the northern landscapes, where abandoned farms lie quiet beneath drifting snow and forgotten settlements fade into the moss, fragments of Viking roofs still whisper their stories. They appear unexpectedly beneath collapsed walls, under centuries of soil, or preserved in the frozen grips of time. Archaeologists who kneel beside these remains often expect little more than decayed wood and indistinct traces. Yet, again and again, they uncover something astonishing. Pieces of roofing so well preserved that their design can still be read with clarity, even 1,000 years after the last fire warmed the longhouse beneath them. In Norway's remote valleys, excavations have revealed birch bark sheets still layered in the same overlapping pattern the builders placed so long ago. Their surfaces carry the imprint of compressed sod, the fibers flattened into a near-seamless membrane. Even after the soil shifted and the structures collapsed, the bark resisted rot, protected by centuries of cool temperatures and the very oils that once repelled rain. Holding these fragments, researchers see not just bark but a message, proof of a material chosen with uncanny foresight. In Iceland and Greenland, where the climate preserved ancient sites with particular gentleness, archaeologists have uncovered sod layers that still hold their structure. Roots fuse together, forming thick mats, like preserved earth manuscripts. These layers reveal how the sod once breathed, drained, and grew stronger with each passing season. Even the soil composition tells a story. Traces of grasses chosen intentionally for their resilience, roots that spread horizontally rather than downward, evidence of a system shaped both by design and by time. Some discoveries carry a sense of quiet awe. A collapsed hall in Greenland revealed rafters still locked together in their lattice arrangement, the joints fitting as tightly as when they were first wedged into place. Though the wood had darkened and softened with age, the structure remained legible, an echo of a design closer to shipbuilding than home building. Storms had erased the walls and floors, but the roof's hidden geometry endured. Not all remains lie buried. In isolated Scandinavian farmsteads, traditional sod roofs still live today, tended by families who maintain them not out of nostalgia, but because they still work. These roofs, some over 60 years old, show little sign of failing. Their sod grows thicker each year. Their bark remains sealed. Their beams, tar-darkened and smoke-seasoned, continue resisting the elements as though time has barely touched them. When modern builders visit these farms, they often leave puzzled, asking why a millennium of progress has not surpassed such simple natural brilliance. The sight of these preserved roofs, crooked, weathered, yet undeniably alive, offers a powerful realization. While empires rose and fell, while kingdoms merged and disappeared, these humble structures endured. They did not need monuments. They did not need legends. Their survival became the story, quietly proving that resilience lies not in force, but in harmony. And now, with the environment and centuries of endurance explored, the narrative turns toward comparison. What has modern building forgotten? What did the Vikings understand that we abandoned? Those questions guide the journey into the next chapter. The decline of the roof did not begin with storms or with new climates. It began with machines. As the world drifted into the industrial age, the slow rhythm of hand-shaped timber gave way to the relentless pace of sawmills and production lines. Wood that once waited for the right season to be harvested now fell beneath spinning blades working year-round. Logs were sliced rapidly, stripped of their natural curves, and forced into the straight, uniform shapes demanded by mass construction. Grain direction, once read carefully like a map of hidden strength, became irrelevant. Efficiency replaced intuition. In factories, lumber moved past steel teeth that never paused to consider knots, bends, or fibers. Each board came out identical, clean and predictable. But predictability is not the same as resilience. The ancient beams that bent under winter's weight had been shaped with respect for the tree's original form. Modern boards, cut quickly and dried even faster, lost that memory. Their fibers were severed. Their natural tension, the subtle force that once allowed timber to flex, was locked into rigid straightness. What had once been adaptable became fragile. Shingles, too, changed. The rough, tar-rich surfaces of the past were replaced by thin asphalt sheets, pressed into neat stacks. They arrived in neat pallets, perfect for fast work. Nail guns, clicking like small machines themselves, secured them with speed no craftsman's hand could match. Houses rose in record time. Yet beneath their polished surfaces lay a compromise invisible to most homeowners. Materials designed to last just long enough, not to endure storms beyond expectation. Chemically treated lumber promised strength with less effort. But many treatments focused on resisting pests rather than preserving the wood's structural soul. The chemicals stiffened the fibers, sometimes making them more vulnerable to cracking. The wood, cut too quickly and dried too intensely, struggled to withstand years of moisture cycles. A modern roof is assembled from parts manufactured for uniformity rather than wisdom. You can hear it in the rhythm of construction sites, air compressors humming, nail guns firing in rapid bursts, boards slapped into place like pieces of a puzzle designed for speed. And while speed builds houses quickly, it rarely builds them well. There's an unsettling irony here. With all our machinery and measurements, our roofs often fail sooner than those raised by hands that moved slowly, guided by generations of understanding. The industrial shortcut didn't only change how we build, it changed how we think. Instead of treating a roof as a living system shaped by climate and craft, we treated it as a product, something to assemble rather than something to understand. This shift created a quiet vulnerability, a flaw hidden in plain sight. And once materials became rigid and uniform, builders embraced another ideal that proved just as dangerous: the belief that straight lines held more strength than the natural curves shaped by storms. Somewhere along the march toward modern building standards, a quiet assumption took hold: that strength lives in straightness. Roofs became rigid triangles built from identical beams, each one milled to look perfect, each line sharpened as if geometry itself could resist the weight of wind. The symmetry is pleasing to the eye, clean, crisp, mathematically reassuring. But nature rarely builds in straight lines, and the Vikings understood something modern builders forgot. Rigidity is fragile. Their beams followed the natural bend of the tree. A rafter curved not because a blueprint demanded it, but because decades of wind had shaped it that way. When set into the roof, these curves became a silent advantage. A curved beam behaves like a spring, absorbing force instead of resisting it. Snow could pile upon it in heavy silence, pressing until the rafter bowed gently, distributing the load to its neighbors. A modern truss, stiff and unwilling to flex, meets the same pressure with tension that builds and builds, until it snaps with a sound sharp enough to wake an entire house. Imagine a Viking longhouse under a winter sky, its roof settling softly under a new snowfall. The rafters shift almost imperceptibly, the entire frame adjusting like a living body, easing itself under a heavy blanket. Now imagine a modern suburban home during an ice storm. The roof barely moves at all. Inside the walls, tiny cracks form. Fasteners strain. Stress pools like water trapped in a corner. What looks orderly on paper becomes brittle in the real world. The ancient builders didn't need to explain this in technical terms. They saw it every year. Trees that bent survived. Trees that resisted splintered. Curves meant resilience. Imperfections meant strength. Their architecture that borrowed that logic. They allowed the wood to keep its memory of storms. And in doing so, they built homes capable of weathering new ones. Modern construction, obsessed with visual neatness, planes the wood flat, cuts out the curve, eliminates the knot, and forces nature into tidiness it never asked for. The result is a roof that looks strong but lacks the instinct to move with the seasons. Even engineered trusses, precise, uniform, faultless, depend on perfection to survive. Yet perfection has no tolerance for stress beyond its limits. This contrast forces a deeper question. How many failures come not from weakness, but from our insistence that buildings obey rules nature never wrote? The Vikings didn't impose order. They let the material speak, and the material told them that flexibility mattered more than form. Once you recognize this truth, another becomes clear. The same rigidity that causes structural failures also amplifies the one enemy modern roofs cannot escape: moisture. A roof that cannot bend also cannot breathe. And a roof that cannot breathe becomes a trap where water hides and decay begins. Which leads us deeper into the next mystery: how the Vikings worked with moisture itself, turning what we fear into something predictable and controlled. Modern builders speak of moisture the way sailors speak of shipwrecks, with dread, with caution, and with the quiet understanding that one mistake can undo everything. So we seal our homes tighter. We wrap roofs in synthetic membranes. We staple down vapor barriers. We pack insulation until no air can pass through. On paper, it looks efficient. In reality, it creates a fragile world where a single tear, a single misplaced nail, a single overlooked gap becomes the beginning of a silent disaster. Moisture slips in, finds nowhere to escape, and begins to rot the structure from within. It moves quietly at first. A thin line of water gathers behind a shingle. A microscopic crack opens in a membrane. Overnight, frost melts beneath improperly vented insulation. Trapped moisture, desperate for a path out, lingers instead. It swells the wood, feeds mold, invites decay. And because every layer is designed to resist rather than channel, a small intrusion becomes a spreading threat, hidden behind drywall, beneath flooring, inside the roof itself. People notice only when stains bloom across ceilings. By then, the damage has already woven itself through the house. The Vikings would have found this approach strange. They didn't try to stop moisture entirely. They guided it. For them, water had a place to go. The sod absorbed it slowly. The birch bark redirected it outward. The rafters breathed beneath layers of air and soil. Each part of the roof understood its role, not in repelling water, but in moving it, controlling it, releasing it. Moisture never pooled. It never hid. It never found a corner where decay could begin. It was part of a cycle, not a threat. Imagine rain falling on a modern roof. It rushes downward in rivulets, searching for the smallest failure. It pries its way beneath shingles, travels along metal flashing, and breaks past the defenses one layer at a time. When it enters, it stays. Now imagine the same storm on a Viking longhouse. The sod catches the rain in slow breaths. The bark below tightens and pushes water outward. Air moves freely through the rafters, drawing moisture away before it lingers long enough to cause harm. One system traps, the other guides. Our war against moisture is a losing one because it is built on the belief that we can force nature into silence. The Vikings lived with a different understanding. Moisture will always find a way in. But with the right design, it will also find a way out. This clarity strips away the illusion of modern superiority. It hints that our complicated systems hide vulnerabilities the Vikings never had to face. And that realization leads to a more uncomfortable truth. The rapid disappearance of old knowledge wasn't just a shift in technique. It was the beginning of a cultural forgetting that reshaped our homes for the worse. The disappearance of Viking roofing knowledge did not happen because it stopped working. It vanished because the world changed faster than memory could hold on. As industrialization swept across Scandinavia, villages that had once built slowly and collectively began to embrace new materials that promised progress. Imported shingles replaced sod. Machine-cut boards replaced curved beams. And birch bark, once peeled in careful sheets and layered with near-religious precision, was dismissed as old-fashioned, a relic of a time not yet illuminated by modern convenience. What happened next was subtle at first. A few farmhouses re-roofed with asphalt instead of earth. A carpenter choosing straight lumber simply because it arrived in perfect stacks. A young builder who never learned how to read the curve of a tree because factories now handled the cutting. The old masters, those whose hands carried decades of seasonal understanding, passed away. Their knowledge, never written, seldom spoken, died quietly with them. No libraries lost it, no wars burned it. It simply slipped through time because no one asked it to stay. Pictures from the early 20th century show the shift clearly. Villages once softened by grassy rooflines began to look sharper, straighter, more modern. People embraced these changes proudly, believing that industry had solved old problems forever. A modern roof looked clean and precise. It promised prestige. It seemed to reflect a world rising out of the past. But beneath that pride was a growing vulnerability no one recognized. The ancient partnership between home and climate had been severed, replaced by materials that fought weather instead of working with it. Imagine an aging longhouse standing beside a newly renovated farmhouse. The longhouse roof, thick with sod, still breathes. Grass grows. Birds land freely. The birch bark beneath remains sealed after decades of storms. But the modern roof next door already shows subtle signs of strain. Shingles curling at the edges, moisture working its way beneath the surface. The speed of construction has won, but the strength has not. A kind of cultural amnesia followed. Within a single generation, the knowledge that had once been essential for survival became irrelevant to a world chasing efficiency. Teachers no longer passed down roof-making wisdom. Children no longer learned how to gather bark or prepare tar pits. The forests lost the familiar footsteps of builders choosing winter timber with instinctive care. And as these traditions faded, so did the understanding of why they mattered. It is painful to realize that 1,000 years of mastery were abandoned, not because they failed, but because they were slow. And in that haste, something irreplaceable slipped away. That loss created the vulnerability modern homes now face. Structures built for convenience rather than endurance. Yet the story doesn't end in disappearance. The next chapter follows the architects, historians, and craftspeople who began to look backward, recognizing that the secrets of Viking roofs were never outdated. They were simply forgotten. The rediscovery of Viking roofing did not begin with nostalgia. It began with confusion. Modern architects and historians, puzzled by fragments of ancient bark and soil that refused to decay, found themselves staring at evidence that contradicted everything they believed about primitive construction. It started in quiet labs, on windswept archaeological sites, and in the dim workshops of Scandinavian experimental farms, places where curiosity outweighed assumption. As these researchers leaned closer, brushing centuries of dirt from preserved birch bark, or lifting beams, still bearing the sheen of ancient tar, the same realization began to stir. The old roofs were not merely functional, they were brilliant. At the Norwegian Folk Museum, an architect traced her fingers along a fragment of bark pulled from beneath a 1,000-year-old structure. Instead of crumbling, it held firm. Its surface still carried the faint, waxy feel of its natural oils. Tests revealed that in many cases, birch bark outlasted modern membranes designed to do the same job. No chemicals, no manufacturing, just nature's own logic, preserved by people who paid attention. Elsewhere, at an experimental farm in Iceland, researchers reconstructed a Viking roof using only the materials and techniques available a millennium ago. They laid the bark carefully, pressed sod atop it, and watched the roof settle into itself, as if waking from a long sleep. Then winter arrived. Snow piled high. Wind carved spirals across the fields. Yet the reconstructed roof did not leak. Not once. Scientists gathered around in disbelief, touching the dry beams beneath as meltwater slid neatly away along the bark's overlapping layers. University labs soon joined the investigation. Engineers compared the thermal performance of sod-based insulation to modern solutions. The results were quietly astonishing. The sod roofs, thick with soil and alive with roots, retained heat more evenly and lost it more slowly than many commercial systems. The temperature beneath them shifted not in sharp spikes, but in gentle curves, mirroring the rhythm of traditional Scandinavian living. These discoveries stirred excitement that bordered on reverence. Architects who had grown accustomed to steel and synthetic membranes found themselves sketching rooflines inspired by ancient curves, contemplating ways to incorporate breathing layers of natural material into modern projects. Craft schools revived tar-making pits, letting resin-rich wood smolder slowly until the old dark liquid bubbled into existence again. Students gathered around, watching the process with the same attentive silence their ancestors once offered. In these spaces, half research, half remembrance, the past became a blueprint for the future. What began as an investigation into forgotten techniques evolved into a subtle shift in perspective. Viking roofs were no longer artifacts of a primitive age. They were reminders that innovation does not always move forward. Sometimes it circles back to an older truth, one waiting patiently for our rediscovery. And as these architects and researchers rebuilt the past piece by piece, one question began to grow. If a reconstructed roof performed this well in controlled settings, how would it stand in the real world, beneath real storms? The true test of Viking roofing did not happen in quiet museum workshops or university labs. It happened beneath open skies, where storms held nothing back. Across Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and even parts of Canada, teams of researchers began reconstructing full-scale Viking roofs to discover whether ancient methods could withstand modern climates. These weren't small experiments. They were entire longhouses, built with winter-felled timber, layered birch bark, and sod stacked thick as it had been 1,000 years ago. And on the day each roof was completed, the same question hovered in the air. Would this hold? The first answers arrived unexpectedly. In Iceland, a reconstructed longhouse faced its inaugural storm. A roaring Atlantic squall that sent sheets of rain racing sideways across the landscape. Researchers, huddled inside with clipboards and cameras, felt the longhouse tremble around them. They listened for leaks, for dripping, for any sign the roof had failed. But instead of water intruding, they heard only the muted patter of rain disappearing into the sod above, then the soft hush of runoff sliding away along birch bark. Hours later, when the storm moved on, the interior beams remained dry. In Norway, a different experiment unfolded. Engineers monitored a reconstructed roof through an entire winter. Snow accumulated on the sod in thick, frozen layers that would have buckled most modern roofs. Yet the ancient design flexed under the weight, the rafters bowing subtly and rising again as the snow melted. Sensors placed beneath the sod showed minimal temperature fluctuation. The house stayed warm during the coldest nights. Season after season, the structure adapted without complaint. A team in Denmark pushed the experiment further. They built 2 small houses side by side, one with modern materials, the other following Viking principles. Then they subjected both to artificial storms in a controlled testing ground. Heavy rain blasted the roofs. Frost cycles were simulated. Wind machines roared. The modern roof failed first, its membrane punctured by ice expansion and its shingles peeling away under pressure. The Viking-inspired roof remained intact. Water flowed exactly where it was guided to go. The bark tightened. The sod shifted imperceptibly, reinforcing itself. But one of the most striking tests took place in Canada, where climate conditions mirrored the harsher ends of the Viking world. A reconstructed roof survived seasons of deep snow, sudden thaws, freezing rain, and relentless wind. Researchers noted how the sod grew thicker each year, how the bark remained sealed, and how the beams maintained their flexibility. During one particularly violent winter storm, they heard the rafters creak like settling ice. Yet, when daylight returned, the roof showed no sign of strain. These demonstrations created a moment of collective realization. The ancient designs were not just adequate, they were extraordinary. They performed with a graceful resilience that modern materials, despite their precision, often failed to match. Something remarkable had been hidden in the past, waiting for modern eyes to see it. And as these reconstructions proved their worth, architects and builders around the world began to ask how such ancient wisdom could shape the homes of the future. As the results of the reconstruction experiments spread, architects and builders across the world began looking at Viking roofs not as relics, but as invitations. In an age of rising energy costs, increasingly violent storms, and growing concern about the environmental toll of industrial materials, the old methods suddenly felt not old at all. They felt timely, even prophetic. What began in a handful of Scandinavian research sites slowly rippled outward, reaching eco-architecture studios, natural building courses, and remote homesteads where people sought a different way to shape shelter. Modern green roofs, once considered niche, even eccentric, found themselves at the center of this movement. Designers began sculpting homes into hillsides, covering rooftops with soil and grasses that echoed the sod layers of ancient longhouses. Some belonged to quiet forest cabins. Others crowned urban buildings with rolling green slopes that softened the skyline. From the outside, these homes appeared to merge with the earth, their silhouettes blurred by vegetation and seasonal color. Yet within them, the science was unmistakable. Temperature stability, stormwater absorption, and cooling effects that rivaled commercial insulation. In Canada and the Pacific Northwest, builders experimented with bark-based membranes, layering sheets of cedar or birch beneath their living roofs. They discovered, to their surprise, that these natural barriers performed with impressive reliability, even outperforming synthetic underlayment in some conditions. The bark expanded when wet, sealed when frozen, and resisted decay with a stubbornness that echoed its ancient use. Craftsmen revived slow joinery, carving wedge-fit joints that tightened with humidity rather than loosening. Others returned to naturally curved timbers, finding structural strength in shapes that followed the tree's original growth. Across Europe, permaculture communities embrace sod roofing as part of their ecological ethos. Workshops filled with students learning to gather soil blocks, lay them carefully, and read their roots the way Viking builders once read the grain of winter-felled pine. The sod roofs they created were not romantic reenactments. They were functional, long-lasting systems designed to work with the land instead of resisting it. Birds nested on them. Moss grew in emerald patches. Rain softened its voice as it landed. Even in cities, the influence appeared. Architects, tired of sterile glass and thin metal, began incorporating green roof systems that mimicked the layered logic of the Vikings. A waterproof natural membrane, a breathing soil layer, a living surface above. These designs cut energy consumption drastically. They restored pockets of habitat for insects and birds. They softened the harsh rhythm of urban heat islands. With each new project, the old ideas slipped quietly into the present, not by force, but by recognition. The Vikings had built roofs for survival. Eco-architects built them for sustainability. But the principles were the same. Build with materials that breathe, let water move, trust natural cycles, and allow a roof to become a living part of the landscape. And as these ancient concepts shaped modern design, one question rose softly through the movement. What else had the Vikings understood that we are only now beginning to remember? As architects, homeowners, and builders sift through the rediscovered wisdom of the Viking roof, a quiet realization begins to form. What we lost was never just a technique. It was a way of seeing. Modern construction, for all its precision and efficiency, often forgets to ask how a home should breathe, move, and age. The Vikings answered those questions intuitively, shaping their roofs from principles that today feel almost radical in their simplicity. And as the modern world rediscovers these ideas, a pattern emerges. Durability comes not from overpowering nature, but from cooperating with it. One of the first lessons is the value of materials that breathe. Modern roofs are sealed so tightly that moisture has nowhere to go. trapped beneath layers designed for uniformity rather than resilience. The Vikings built with wood, bark, and sod, materials that absorbed, released, and redirected water as naturally as fields and forests do. Today, architects experimenting with breathable membranes and natural insulation find themselves echoing this ancient logic, discovering that ventilation is not a flaw but a lifeline. Another lesson lies in layered systems. Modern roofs depend on single membranes that must perform every task perfectly. When they fail, the failure is absolute. The Viking roof relied on redundancy. Sod slowed the rain, bark redirected it, rafters guided it, and airflow dried whatever remained. Each layer offered support to the others. As builders reconsider this approach, new designs focus on systems rather than singular solutions, spreading responsibility across materials rather than isolating it. Curved timber reveals a third truth. In an age obsessed with straight lines, the idea that flexibility creates strength feels counterintuitive. Yet natural curves distribute stress more evenly than rigid trusses. As engineers incorporate bold beams, arched frames, and organic joinery into sustainable design, they discover structures that endure with surprising grace. The Vikings did not chase perfection. They followed the truth written in the wood itself. A fourth lesson reminds us to respect seasonal cycles. Modern construction happens year-round, often forcing materials into conditions that cause problems later. Vikings harvested trees in winter when sap retreated, ensuring timber cured slowly and evenly. Today's builders who experiment with seasonal timing report better results, stronger boards, less warping, and materials that settle comfortably into place. Perhaps the most profound lesson is this: avoid trapping moisture. Allow it to escape, breathe, and follow predictable paths. Modern homes lose battles against water because they cage it. Viking roofs guided it. The difference is subtle but transformative. Together, these lessons form a quiet revelation. The strength of Viking roofs was never mystical. It was practical wisdom shaped by climate, community, ritual, and patience. While few people today will construct full sod roofs or harvest birch bark in the old ways, the principles behind them remain profoundly relevant. As these truths return to modern architecture, they bridge the thousand-year gap between past and present. And from this bridge arises a deeper question. If ancient builders mastered wisdom, we are only now relearning. What does that say about our relationship with knowledge itself? That question leads the story into the next chapter, where architecture meets philosophy, and forgotten truths shape how we think about home. In an age where construction schedules are measured in weeks and deadlines tick forward with digital precision, it is difficult to imagine a world where building was allowed to move at the pace of seasons. Yet for the Vikings, slowness was not an inconvenience. It was the foundation of strength. Their roofs emerged not from rushed plans or compressed timelines, but from winters of waiting, summers of preparation, and autumns of quiet observation. Every phase depended on the rhythm of the land, and nothing meaningful was forced ahead of its time. Timber was cut only when winter tightened the forests and sap retreated into the roots. Builders waited for that moment, the way farmers wait for the right frost. Once felled, the logs rested beneath cold skies, their moisture escaping gradually, their fibers settling naturally. No kilns hurried them. No chemical treatments pushed them into premature usefulness. They dried the way mountains age, with patience. The beams that resulted from this slow preparation held a steadiness impossible to mimic through speed. Even the birch bark demanded time. It peeled easiest in early summer, when sap loosened its grip, and it needed weeks of sun and shadow to curl, flatten, and find its final texture. Builders spread the sheets across open ground, letting breezes turn them crisp, and letting warm days melt their resinous oils into protective layers. To rush this process was to weaken the very membrane that shielded the home from rain. Then came the sod, carried block by block and laid gently atop the roof. It did not settle overnight. It settled through seasons, rain pressing it downward, roots spreading, soil knotted into a single cohesive mass. The Vikings trusted this slow evolution. They understood that a roof built in haste might stand proudly for a moment, but would crumble quietly in the years that followed. A roof given time became something else entirely. A living structure capable of outlasting generations. This slowness extended beyond materials. It shaped the work itself. Villagers paused to study beams before lifting them. They watched how rafters behaved under their own weight. They waited for the right weather to raise a roof, knowing that certain winds or moisture levels could warp even the strongest timber. Every delay was intentional. Every pause added resilience. The modern world often treats slowness as waste. The Vikings treated it as wisdom. In this unhurried approach, durability was born. The roof did not fight the land, it matured with it. And the more closely we look at the results, the more we see that the strength of Viking construction came not from force or efficiency, but from the willingness to let nature set the pace. This understanding leads naturally into a deeper question of perspective. What happens when builders align themselves with their environment rather than attempt to control it? That shift, subtle yet profound, forms the heart of the next section. Modern construction speaks in the language of control. Barriers, seals, locks, and engineered defenses meant to hold nature at bay. But the Vikings lived by a different philosophy entirely. They watched how snow curled across the land, how rain traveled down bark, how wind combed through valleys, and they built in alignment with those movements rather than against them. Their roofs were not fortresses. They were conversations. Each layer listened to the sky, the season, the ground below. And in that harmony, they found a strength modern systems often lack. Consider the path of water. Today, we trap it behind impermeable surfaces, confident that our membranes will keep every drop out. But when those systems fail, as all rigid systems inevitably do, water becomes a hidden adversary. The Vikings, by contrast, guided moisture along predictable routes. Birch bark welcomed the rain but insisted it move outward. Sod absorbed, slowed, and released it. Air drifted through the rafters, drying what the storm left behind. Nothing was trapped. Nothing was forced. By allowing nature to behave as it always had, they transformed a threat into a manageable rhythm. Wind offered a similar lesson. Modern roofs brace themselves, stiffening in defiance. They resist until they reach a breaking point. Viking roofs moved. Their curves channeled wind away. Their flexible beams shifted under pressure. Their overhanging eaves softened the edges where turbulence would otherwise tear. The builders didn't attempt to dominate the wind. They accepted its presence and shaped their roofs to dance with it. In that fluidity lay resilience. Temperature, too, found its answer in harmony. Instead of insulating against the land with layers of synthetic material, Viking roofs used earth itself. Sod worked with seasonal changes, not against them. In winter, snow became an additional blanket. In summer, grass cooled the roof through natural evaporation. This relationship between shelter and environment created stability, not through mechanical force, but through shared equilibrium. What emerges from these choices is a quiet but profound philosophy. Strength comes not from opposition, but from alignment. When modern builders fight the climate, they engage in a battle they cannot win indefinitely. Every year brings harsher storms, more unpredictable moisture, greater strain on rigid systems. But the Vikings had no illusion of victory. They understood that nature is not a problem to solve, but a partner with patterns to follow. This world view shaped every curve of their roofs, every joint, every layer. It asked them to observe more than they imposed, to adapt more than they resisted. And the structures that rose from this mindset endured not because they were stronger in a brute sense, but because they were wiser in their acceptance. From this harmony springs another truth. The builders themselves were shaped by the craft, just as the craft was shaped by nature. Building was not labor to them, it was identity. And in the next section, the story turns toward the people behind the roofs, whose quiet pride and generational skill created shelters that carried their legacy long after their hands let go. To the Vikings, building a roof was never a task to be checked off a list. It was an act that revealed who they were. Every beam carried the imprint of a builder's patience. Every joint held the memory of hands that shaped it. Craftsmanship was not merely something they practiced. It was something they embodied. Their homes rose from the land with the same care they brought to carving ships, forging blades, or weaving stories. Skill was not a trade. It was a form of identity, a thread woven into the fabric of their society. Imagine a young boy watching his father select a curved branch from the forest. The father does not explain in technical terms why that piece will serve as a rafter. He simply turns it slowly, showing the way the grain twists, the way the wood carries the memory of storms. The boy learns through observation, through touch, through the unspoken understanding that materials are something to be read, not forced. These lessons pass quietly from generation to generation, carried more by example than by instruction. Craftsmanship in this world was tied to pride, not arrogant pride, but the pride of knowing that a roof built correctly would protect the family long after the builder was gone. When a rafter fit perfectly into place, when the bark sealed without cracking, when the sod settled into a soft, living blanket, the builder felt the satisfaction of contributing something enduring. The work reflected not only skill, but character, patience, humility, and a willingness to let nature guide the hand. Contrast this with the rhythm of modern building sites. Subcontractors arrive for a few hours, complete their portion, and vanish to the next project. They may never meet the family who will live beneath the roof. They may never return to see how the house weathers its first winter. The work becomes segmented, compartmentalized, detached from personal meaning. The roof is assembled quickly, efficiently, and often anonymously, labor, not legacy. The Vikings lived differently. Their craft was inseparable from the land, their families, and their sense of belonging. When a roof beam creaked during a storm, it wasn't an irritation. It was the voice of the home adjusting itself. When smoke darkened the rafters over years of long nights, it wasn't grime. It was history settling into the wood. A roof was a biography written in timber and soil, telling the story of the people who raised it. Because the craft was tied to identity, shortcuts were rare d'oeuvre. A poorly fitted joint reflected badly on the builder. A weak beam put the entire village at risk. Pride and responsibility wove themselves into every decision, creating a culture where good work was expected, because good work meant protection, honor, and memory. And it is here, in this merging of skill and self, that a final truth emerges. Ancient knowledge matters not because it is old, but because it carries a philosophy modern life often forgets. That reflection leads naturally into the final section of the chapter, where the importance of this wisdom becomes unmistakably clear. It is easy to imagine ancient knowledge as something sealed in the past. Useful once, perhaps admirable, but ultimately outpaced by modern tools and technologies. Yet, as the story of Viking roofs unfolds, a quiet counter-truth rises to the surface. What we often call primitive was, in many ways, a refined understanding of resilience, balance, and humility. These builders worked without equations, yet created homes that endured centuries of storms. They followed no written manuals, yet crafted systems modern engineers are only now beginning to rediscover. Their knowledge was not outdated. It was distilled. And it still matters. It matters because the challenges the Vikings faced are the same ones we face today. Wind, water, cold, heat, time. The difference is that we tend to confront these forces with attempts at domination, while they approached them as partners in a long conversation. Their roofs endured not because they conquered nature, but because they learned how to live with it. In a world now grappling with unpredictable climates and rising environmental costs, this lesson feels more relevant than ever. It matters because their approach valued longevity over speed. Each material was chosen for its ability to strengthen over time, not for how quickly it could be installed. Today, many structures begin deteriorating the moment they are completed, victims of cost-cutting and rushed workmanship. The Vikings remind us that endurance requires patience, that slowness is not inefficiency, but intention. Their roofs were designed to mature, not expire. It matters because their techniques were sustainable. They built with local materials, harvested in season, shaped by hand, and encouraged to breathe. Nothing required factories or fossil fuels. Nothing relied on chemicals that faded in a decade. Every layer of their roof worked with natural cycles and returned to the earth when its life ended. In an age striving for greener solutions, their ancient systems stand not as curiosities, but as blueprints for what eco-friendly construction can be. Most of all, it matters because their craftsmanship carried meaning. A roof was more than an assembly of parts. It was a reflection of community, tradition, and identity. When knowledge disappears, something deeper than technique is lost. A way of seeing the world fades. And as we rediscover Viking methods, we are not merely recovering building skills. We are recovering a mindset that respects time, land, and the quiet intelligence of nature. This is why ancient knowledge still echoes in the present. It reminds us that progress is not always linear, and that wisdom can lie behind us as much as ahead. To look back is not to regress, it is to reclaim what was abandoned too quickly. With this understanding, the narrative now turns toward its final chapter. Everything learned, from materials to culture, from engineering to philosophy, begins to converge into one final, unifying perspective. The question that opened this journey was simple enough. Why did Viking roofs endure while ours surrender so easily? Yet the answer, as the winding path revealed, was never a single fact or forgotten technique. It was a tapestry, woven from seasons, materials, craftsmanship, philosophy, and the quiet intelligence of people who lived in rhythm with their world. As we return now to the beginning, the discoveries gathered along the way take on new clarity, settling into place like the layers of the roof itself. It begins with the trees. The Vikings read forests the way others read maps. They harvested timber in winter, when sap slept deep within the trunk, creating wood less prone to rot and warping. They shaped beams with axes that followed the natural grain, preserving the tree's internal logic rather than severing it. These early decisions, slow and attentive, gave each raft a strength that modern, hastily milled lumber rarely matches. Then came the bark, thin, pale, and astonishingly durable. Birch bark, laid in overlapping sheets, formed the heart of the roof's waterproofing. It did not crack in frost or blister in heat. It swelled when wet, sealing its own seams, and relaxed when dry, ready for the next storm. The Vikings paired this simple material with layers of sod, whose roots intertwined into a living shield that insulated the longhouse and steadied the roof beneath the shifting weight of winter. The structure itself held another secret. Imperfect beams, curved, knotted, shaped by wind and time, became natural arches capable of bending under pressure. The joinery flexed rather than fractured. Moisture was guided, not trapped. Smoke, drifting upward from the central hearth, preserved the wood that supported the entire system. And above all, every element worked with every other element, creating a roof that behaved less like an object and more like a breathing, responsive organism. But the materials and methods tell only part of the story. The true endurance came from the mindset behind the craft. These roofs were built slowly, communally, with intention rather than haste. They were shaped by people who believed shelter was not a product but a responsibility. A poorly built roof threatened not only comfort but survival. And so knowledge passed from hand to hand, not as instruction, but as identity. What the Vikings can still teach us is not limited to how they selected wood or shaped beams. They teach us to build with patience, to value flexibility over rigidity, to trust natural cycles, and to design systems where every layer supports the next. They remind us that durability is born not from resisting nature, but from understanding it. And perhaps most importantly, they show us that forgotten wisdom often lies hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. With these lessons gathered, the story now shifts toward the present day, toward the ways we might bring these ancient principles into our own homes, our own decisions, and our own relationship with the world that shelters us. Bringing Viking wisdom into the modern world does not mean covering our homes with sod or peeling sheets of birch bark beneath the summer sun. It means rediscovering the principles that once shaped roofs capable of thriving in the harshest climates. These lessons, quiet yet enduring, still apply today, woven into decisions about ventilation, materials, and the pace at which we build. The past does not ask us to imitate it. It simply asks us to listen. One of the clearest lessons is the value of letting a home breathe. Modern houses often lock moisture inside sealed layers, trapping it in corners where decay begins unseen. The Vikings avoided this by allowing air to move freely through the roof. We can echo this through better ventilation, strategic airflow pathways, and designs that guide moisture out rather than confining it. In doing so, we acknowledge a truth the ancients understood instinctively. Water becomes dangerous only when it cannot escape. Another wisdom lies in embracing flexibility. Viking rafters bent under heavy snow, shifting without breaking. Today's builders, striving for precise lines and rigid forms, forget that materials expand, contract, and respond to the world around them. Choosing materials that tolerate movement, engineered woods that flex, roofing systems that adapt through seasons, brings our designs closer to nature's preferred language. A flexible roof is not a compromise. It is a survival strategy. Layering remains a powerful idea as well. The Vikings built roofs where each layer compensated for another's weakness. Modern systems often rely on a single barrier, one membrane, one coating, one solution. But resilience is found in redundancy. By designing roofs with multiple protective stages, outer surfaces that deflect, middle layers that absorb, inner structures that dry, we create homes where a minor failure does not bloom into catastrophe. Seasonal timing is another forgotten ally. Viking builders waited for winter to harvest wood, allowing nature to dry beams slowly and evenly. Today, rushing construction during humid months or ignoring wood moisture content leads to warping and premature decay. While we cannot always build at the perfect moment, we can pay attention to the conditions materials require. Patience, even in small measures, lengthens the life of a home. Most importantly, the Vikings teach us to regard our climate not as something to overpower, but as something to understand. A house built in a coastal region should respond differently from one built in a snowy valley. Roof pitch, material choice, drainage patterns, each should reflect the land beneath and the sky above. The Vikings built for place. We often build for convenience. These principles do not ask us to turn back the clock. They invite us to carry forward what still holds truth. A home shaped with attention, patience, and respect for the world around it becomes more than shelter. It becomes a companion to the landscape and a guardian for those who live beneath it. As we absorb these lessons, a deeper reflection arises, not about roofs alone, but about the fragile ways human knowledge fades. That reflection forms the heart of the next chapter. There is a quiet sorrow in the idea that knowledge can disappear, not through catastrophe, but through forgetfulness. Skills that once shaped the survival of entire communities can fade as gradually as footprints in snow. When we imagine the last Viking craftsman setting down his tools, we rarely consider the weight of what he carried, the unwritten wisdom, the practiced instincts, the patient understanding of wood, soil, and weather. He may not have known that he was among the last to hold those secrets. Knowledge rarely announces its departure. It simply fades when no one asks it to stay. Picture him in the final light of a long northern evening, wiping resin from his hands as the village around him changes. New materials begin to arrive by boat, smelling of tar and promise. New ideas drift in from distant lands, lighter, quicker, more convenient. And slowly, the old rituals slip from daily life. The builders who once gathered in winter forests now look elsewhere for materials. The tar pits fall cold. The birch trees no longer bear the careful scars of harvest. The craft, still strong, begins to feel unnecessary. Modern eyes might view this as progress, but there is a deeper, more complex emotion in acknowledging what was lost. Viking roofs were not merely structures, they were expressions of a way of seeing. They reflected a world where craftsmanship was an inheritance, where nature was a collaborator, and where patience was a form of intelligence. When that worldview receded, something larger than construction techniques vanished. A philosophy, quiet, durable, and deeply intertwined with the land, fell out of daily use. The emotional weight of that loss doesn't come from nostalgia. It comes from recognition. We stand today in homes built quickly, efficiently, but often without memory. Our materials travel farther than our footsteps. Our tools work faster than our hands. Our buildings stand tall yet feel strangely fragile. And in this fragility, a longing emerges. A sense that somewhere behind us lies a steadier wisdom we abandoned too soon. Yet the story does not end with loss alone. Knowledge has a way of resurfacing, not as perfect replicas of the past, but as echoes shaped by new needs. Architects returning to natural materials, craftsmen reviving old joinery, homeowners rethinking insulation and airflow. These are signs that the forgotten is being remembered. The rebirth does not look identical to its origins, but it carries the same spirit. Respect for time, cooperation with nature, and trust in simplicity. In this rediscovery, the emotional weight becomes lighter. What once seemed gone becomes something we can reach for again, piece by piece. The sadness transforms into gratitude for the fragments that survived, for the roofs that refused to crumble, for the wisdom preserved in bark, sod, and smoke. And with this renewed connection to the past, the story moves toward its final image, a single roof standing against winter, a symbol of everything we sought to understand. In the far north, where winter descends like a great white silence, a lone longhouse stands at the edge of a field. Snow drifts against its walls in slow, deliberate waves. The wind, sharp as broken ice, presses against the structure with ancient familiarity. And yet the roof, dark with age, heavy with sod, curved like the back of some resting creature, meets the storm without fear. It bends, it settles, it breathes, it remembers. This roof has seen countless winters before this one. It has felt storms older than any living memory. Each season added something to it. Another layer of roots, another brush of smoke, another settling of soil beneath the weight of snow. It learned the language of the weather long ago. Now, when the storm rises, it does not brace for battle. It simply shifts, as if greeting an old friend. Inside the longhouse, the air is warm with the glow of a small fire. Smoke curls upward, tracing the familiar journey it has taken for generations, drifting between beams darkened by decades of its touch. The rafters creak softly as the wind pushes outside. But this sound is not one of strain. It is a voice, a low, patient hum that reaches into the bones of the house and says, "I know this. I have stood through worse." Outside, snow gathers across the sod in deepening blankets. Instead of crushing the roof, it insulates it, pressing gently into the living mat of roots that hold the soil together. The birch bark beneath tightens as moisture settles, forming a shield as effective now as it was centuries ago. Water flows where it should. Air moves where it must. Every part of the roof responds in quiet coordination. A harmony forged from time, craft, and intention. The storm continues. But the longhouse neither stiffens nor yields. It exists in a space between resistance and acceptance, a place only ancient wisdom can occupy. And when dawn breaks, pale and cold over the horizon, the roof glistens beneath a soft sheen of frost. The world is quiet again. Winter, despite all its force, has bowed. Standing before this house, one understands the deeper lesson hidden in the story of Viking roofs. Endurance is not born from overpowering the elements, but from understanding them. Strength is not a refusal to bend, but the ability to bend without breaking. Wisdom is not captured in diagrams, but in choices shaped by observation, patience, and humility. In the end, this roof is more than a structure. It is a symbol of forgotten craftsmanship, of ancient intelligence, of the timeless relationship between shelter and landscape. It reminds us that the most lasting solutions are often the simplest, the quietest, the ones shaped slowly by hands that listened. And so the story closes on this image. A roof standing firm in the frozen north, carrying 1,000 years of memory, whispering across time that good design does not age, it endures.